What I have, as soon as I put on my glasses so I can read them, are questions for Dr. Sharpley. So, Andrew, give yourself a microphone. There you go, left or right. And we won't have time to go through all of these, but we're going to try to hit the high points, I think. Dr. Sharpley, there's a question brought forth about, you made a comment about cover crops releasing nutrients, releasing phosphorus after they're either sprayed, killed down, or senesced at the end of the growing season in the spring. We have no microphone. The question is just to elaborate on that a little bit and give us an idea of what. Okay, the question was a winter annual cover crop planted for conservation practices, when it is killed in the spring or when it dies naturally or senesces, that you made a comment about phosphorus being released from that biomass. The person asked the question would like to just elaborate on that a little bit.
The idea that the Europeans call them catch crops, which is kind of the whole idea to a certain extent. One was to catch those nutrients and retain them in that cover crop, which either then could be tilled in, as the question says. And so there's nutrients that are taken up, obviously because it's growing, and different crops that we use for cover crops, there's a lot of different ones, can remove that phosphorus, and then as it decays, it becomes plant available. It's a slow release of nutrients, and so that's the idea of that idea that you're tilling it, you're breaking it up, or you kill it, but at the same time, you've got to remember that that cover crop, as it does store nutrients or it takes them up, which is what you want to do, it recycles it in the form which the next crop can use. But if you get runoff, then the consideration is this other side, that it could become a source. And so it's not just killing it, leaving it there, letting it rain, and then moving on. It's you've got to carefully manage, I think, the cover crops to optimize their benefits that we know that they have. And one of them is just plain old soil protection, root establishment, and protecting that soil. I hope that answers the question.
I think it did, and kind of a continuation of that question, there's another question about local rules don't allow manure application to growing cover crops in the wintertime. And the question, why is that not a good idea, or why would it be a good idea maybe perhaps to allow some manure application to a growing cover crop in the wintertime?
I guess that's probably a loaded question in terms
Absolutely.
of saying it would be a good idea. I think the idea of the cover crop, to a large extent, was to grow something to protect the soil, but also to use nutrients that were already there, and that it was something that a farmer might get some payback from, either in some forage, letting cows graze it in some places. That happens, or interseeding, but it wasn't the idea that it's going to be a major cash return for a farmer. It was more of a protective measure. So therefore, applying fertilizer or manures to it might defeat the purpose to a certain extent. So I think that's again, it's probably something that it defeats the object of having the cover crop there in the first place. And I think if you've got want to put a cover crop in, it means you've got already adequate nutrients there for that crop to get established, and therefore applying new manure in the winter might obviously negate create other concerns that would offset the benefit of the cover crop.
Okay, thank you. There was some message in your presentation about having the necessity to transport phosphorus from some areas where there's not available resources to utilize it efficiently to other areas. And the question is, isn't that just moving the problem around and creating a new problem at the place where the manure is being moved to?
That's a good question, and we hear that all the time. And I guess if one does it for long enough, yes. One of the issues I think that we've had with Oklahoma, Arkansas is once that manure leaves that farm, then it's the recipient's responsibility to be using that in a responsible way. Now, in some cases, that litter or that manure is going to an area which doesn't require the same nutrient management planning and the detail of the requirement.
We're friends, I can do this.
Oh, sorry. I hope everybody's heard what I've been saying. Oh, I'm used to talking to myself, so I hope we can hear me now. That there is that premise that it is going to cause you're just shifting the problem from one area to the other, as long as the person that's receiving it, the idea is that they are using it in a responsible manner. In our area, we don't have the requirement that those recipients at the moment, because they're not in an area which is that requires that nutrient management planning. But at some stage, those recipients that get it would probably have to have some nutrient management planning so that you would not be just shifting the area from one to another. Now, obviously, that mileage and that distance is going to expand with time. So you've got to broaden that area where you're transporting it to. But, you know, we've got to remember the distances are, at the moment, probably a couple of 100 miles, 300 miles where we are, because we've got good road structure. But we still know, and you know, there's people from IPNI here in the audience, that the majority of soils are still deficient in phosphorus for optimum crop growth. So there's a lot of potential out there for this manure to be a resource.
All right, thanks. And kind of a follow-up on that one, one that was a little bit more specific about moving manure from point A to point B, is about applying it to manage turf grass. Because in this neck of the woods, we have lots of turf, lots of lawn, a lot of turf out there. And right now that doesn't happen. And could you foresee that being a logical, from a scientific point of view, place to redistribute excess manure to?
Yes.
I love an answer like that. That's great.
Well, we've seen that. I mean, I know that it does actually, you know, the answer is yes. But I've seen examples in Arkansas where it is going to turfgrass producers, and that turfgrass is going to Dallas or other areas. It gets shipped out further, but those nutrients are getting shipped out with that turf. But they are major users of the litter, and a lot's going, and it's going further because the turf is getting a better price for it, and so they can afford to pay that extra mileage cost. Because most, I'm assuming there's some farmers here, those that use poultry litter, it's one of those things you get hooked on. There's a lot of other benefits from just the nitrogen and the phosphorus, the organic, the microbial health of the soil is so much improved. You get major other benefits that farmers probably like to see more than just the nitrogen and the phosphorus, and turf is one of those that, yeah, and in that case you are, turf's taking it up, you're moving it out, and it is a recycling system.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to merge two questions together here. They both have to do with looking down the road, looking at our global future, and having a lot of mouths to feed in the future, and having food supply concerns as we go, decade after decade after decade down the road. And if we're going to be facing the task of feeding more people and keeping farm productivity higher in the future, is it a good idea to legislate/regulate soil P levels now when we're going to need them later? And tie that in with, if you could please, the comments you made about cheap food and good water quality and how it's hard to do both. Anything else you want to talk about?
I guess the idea is that we cannot, if we want to manage for the water quality, it's a bit like the analogy, and Walter made some analogies, but you can't have your cake and eat it too, in that we want the cheap protein, and therefore the most efficient way of doing it to maintain the prices and what we've come to expect is the confined animal feeding operations are the only way that you can do that. Obviously, there's niche markets and more profitable costs for free range, but for the mass people that want that, then that's the way to do it. So I guess the one sense is if there's enough in the soil for crops to grow, then you, from an agronomic point of view, it's difficult for a scientist to say that crop needs any more. Now, there may be starter fertilizers are needed, but then that's from an agronomic point. So if you want to then transfer that threshold to soils, that's when this gray area of this idea of runoff is also a consideration. So the kickback on the idea of having a threshold is, yeah, the soils that it's not, there's enough there for the crop to need, so you really can't justify it from an agronomic point of view. But the other point is, if we have soils that maybe have a high vulnerability because they're near to a stream, they're sloping, they're clay soils, so they are very vulnerable to runoff, and they do not need a lot of phosphorus in them, or they can be avoided from putting manure fertilizer on. There are some soils that are vulnerable that if you just looked at soil test P, you wouldn't catch those because of where they are and the type of nature that they are at risk, even though there's a low level of phosphorus in them from applying P to them. So the threshold debate, I really hedged around it, I guess, but the bottom line is, from an agronomic point of view, yeah, there is a threshold, but when we go to water quality, it becomes a little bit, if you specifically want to manage that based on the water quality, then that's different, it's more site specific. The global idea of feeding people was that we, to a certain extent, we've set some guidelines and we try to get water quality back to what we see as ecologically pristine, and that suggests that those conditions are before people lived in watersheds, and we don't have that. Watersheds by nature are leaky. A lot of times the nutrients that we see coming off is not bad management. It's not bad practice in the case of farmers. If watersheds are leaky, and they will, once you put some on there, some of it's going to wash off. And what Walter and others you'll see have shown that you don't need much to wash off. And so this idea of the green pastures and blue waters is we are going to really struggle to meet that 037, which is a ecological criteria, which is oligotrophic or getting way down there. We pass that. And in some cases, I think we need to consider what water quality do we want or expect, and what are actually achievable. And those sometimes may not be exactly the same.
All right, great. And Andrew, one last one for you, and then we're going to switch gears over to Dr. Boynton. You say that all states are working on and using some sort of a P-transport assessment tool. The question asker want to know, is that true? And are all states doing that?
Yes. Maryland is just part of the other states. There's, I think, 48, 49 states now have what we call a risk assessment to PMT. I guess, I'm sorry, Lynn, that we weren't supposed to mention that, but it is a tool, and other states have that as part of their what they call a 590 nutrient management planning, which NRCS put out there for conservation programs. And in our state, if farmers want some cost share funds to help them do something, then in some cases they have to have compliance with that 590, which means now that has a water quality as well as an agronomic component. And so that risk assessment is done by a phosphorus index, which is what PMT is. And every state has a choice to either choose a phosphorus indexing tool, which accounts for not just the amount of phosphorus in soil, but this risk, this runoff, and what we've talked about and shown you a little bit about, or else to use an agronomic threshold. In most states, the majority of states, I think there's 2 that don't use this risk assessment tool for their nutrient management planning. There were concerns that pressure from groups to revise that 590 standard, and it became perhaps more rigorous than one would like, and so it's being revised. We have the same cases like with soil testing, and I'll finish here in a minute. The soil testing, that it varies from state to state line. If you're a farmer on one side of the line, you send a sample and you get another state, You send a sample somewhere else, you get different recommendations. That does not make sense. That should not be happening, and we're trying to fix that. But it's the same with the index. You've got neighboring farms that have different states, different tools. That should not be the case. And so what's happening now is that NRCS were given this problem, and they were presented to them. They had the wherefore and the good sense, to come up with some funds to help people come up and revise these 590 standards for state by state. So the NRCS put the buck where it was needed in this case to help states revise their 590 standard and make sure that they were doing the right job, and that there was more national basis of comparisons, that they were all working the way that they were supposed to work initially. And so that's taking place, and I think that's going to probably finish within the next year, 2 years, and each state will then have a tool which will be more accountable, and hopefully they will all give out the same recommendations. The process might be different because different soils in different states.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Sharpley. We're going to switch gears, and Walter, if you're ready.
I've got no choice.
All right, snuggle up to that microphone. The first question we're going to pose to you from the audience is, if phosphorus is a controlling factor in the bay in the late winter and early spring, does it make sense to apply all farm manures, poultry litters, municipal sewage sludges to the land at that time of year? Or would it make sense to spread it out over a larger period of time, over more of the year?
This is a land question and a water question. The land part of it, that's simply not my field, so I'm not going to just speculate on that. What I can say is that a large fraction of the N&P that gets into the bay comes in during the winter-spring period. That's the period when the river flows high. That's when the loads are the greatest. The loads are the lowest in the late summer and early fall. The bay has a way of retaining nutrients that come in. So if I had my druthers, I would love to see load reductions occur, particularly in the winter, because that's already where they're the biggest. Whether applications of fertilizer on the land with timing makes a difference, I'd leave that to the people who know something about it.
Okay, very good. And there's a couple questions we had about, you laid the premise that one of the underlying causes is the lack of oxygen in the deep waters down near the sediments. And is it possible to mechanically pump oxygen from the surface down to those deep waters and cure that problem?
I love that question. I first came to the Chesapeake in 1969. And I'm from Boston, in case you haven't noticed a little accent creeping in here and there. And I think in my career here, this would mark the 4th time that somebody said, hey, we just need to pump oxygen down into the bottom water. Using that in reservoirs is reasonably common. So we always turn that question over to our physicist friends, people that do circulation modeling and all those kind of measurements. And the amount of energy that it would take to turn the water of the Chesapeake Bay over, in other words, get oxygen into the bottom water, is absolutely astronomical. The energy it takes to break that stratification is stupendous. So the answer to that is no. I would love it if the answer was yes.
All right.
The answer is a definitive nope.
Ain't gonna happen.
No,
all right. I'm paraphrasing a couple different questions here together. Once phosphorus gets into the water column and starts reacting with the algae, et cetera, and your feedback cycles, et cetera, does it matter where that phosphorus comes from, whether it's from plants, from impervious surfaces, from stormwater runoff, from ag sources, from sewage treatment plants?
For all practical purposes, no. If it's dissolved in organic phosphorus, some people call it soluble reactive phosphorus. Some people call it PO4. It's the kind of phosphorus plants can use. If that's the type we're talking about, for all practical purposes, no.
Okay. And now something relating to major events that may disrupt that system, one natural, one non-natural. And I think you might be able to tie these together, and we'll see. What does dredging of channels have to do with this disrupting the system? And the natural side, you have a major hurricane event, a major flow disruption. How does that disrupt the cycle if they can be linked?
Well, dredging can be a pretty sensitive topic. We're building islands now in the Chesapeake at great expense to dispose of dredged material. We and others have done evaluations of dredging in the bay, and there's no question that while dredging operations are going on, nutrient concentrations increase, turbidity increases. Those effects and benthic organisms are disrupted. Those seem to be very transient events. A biogeochemist named Jeff Cornwell, who probably has forgotten more about sediment geochemistry this morning than I know, he and I did a bunch of calculations where if you took that dredged material, how much nitrogen and how much phosphorus would you be adding to the annual nutrient budget of the bay? And the answer is trivial, really, really tiny. That news was not well accepted because dredging is a very obvious deal. It doesn't look good, but the answer is not much. With regards to major storm events, I think we're learning more and more. In 1972, in June, we had Tropical Storm Agnes dumped a huge amount of rain in the Susquehanna River Basin, and the flows at Conowingo, which an annual average flow is about maybe 45,000 cubic feet per second, went to almost 1.2 million cubic feet per second. So, I mean, it was a huge blasted event. They thought at one point the dam would go, etc. Put a large amount of sediment, nutrient, nitrogen, and phosphorus into the bay system, changed the salinity structure for a while. Fortunately, some people were out there measuring algal biomass and algal productivity before and after that event. And we could see a clear signal in that for 2 years, and then gone. Okay, gone. Could not detect any residual history from that huge event. All right, a more recent event, Tropical Storm Lee deposited about, there's a guy sitting in the front row who knows the exact numbers, but it was about half of Agnes. Yeah? Okay, half of Agnes, which is still a huge event. And there's an interesting story here about resiliency. That water came tearing over the dam, down a little bit of the Susquehanna River, and dooged into the bay. A lot of photographs you've seen about turbidity in the water, brown water, etc. Scary stuff, not good. However, that turbidity didn't last for a great long time. And there was a giant seagrass meadow right at the mouth of the Susquehanna River that had been regrowing beautifully since about 2000. And when that event hit, the concern was that seagrass community is toast. When the water cleared enough so that people could look, they found, yes, indeed, that bed was damaged, but it was not toast. About a year and a half later, it was back in good shape. So one of the messages I think we're seeing here with portions of the bay, it really hints, and by the way, I don't want anyone to leave here thinking that Walter says we have a restored bay. We have a long way to go. What I am saying is, I think we've been doing the right thing, and we're seeing the kind of hints and results that we should see. That's what theory and practice says we should see, and we're seeing it. So I'm saying we're on the right track. We've got a long way to go. Anyway, that bed was apparently strong enough to withstand that kind of really unusual event. Was it damaged? Yep. Did it revive? Also, yes. And that's really important.
Okay, that's a great answer. All right, 3 announcements, and then we're going to take a little break. Okay, first announcement is that questions that were not used during this session, we're going to incorporate into the large panel at the end. So your question may still get up here, okay? Secondly, those certified crop advisors who are in the room looking for CEUs, that sign up will be at the end of the day. All right, so you can't skip out early. Third, we're going to have a break until 10:45 promptly. We will restart at 10:45. And lastly, let me thank our first two speakers for doing a great job. Thank you, sir.